Nicely done. How we doing, Bethany Church? That was terrible. All right. Hey, my name is James Brown, and I serve you as a pastor here. And if you're new with us in this space or tuning in online, just want to let you know I'm so glad you're here. Welcome you personally. I want to do that. In fact, I would argue that you showed up on an awesome Sunday because we are in the second to last week of this teaching series that we have called Origin Stories. And this series is based on a Bible book called Genesis, not the rock band, but the Bible book. And we're digging into this book because we believe that while every story has a beginning, the book of Genesis is actually the beginning of every story. And so I just want to set the groundwork there. And if this maybe is your first time tuning in or in this room with us, I want to start off the sermon today with an apology. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. There's a pretty good chance at some point in the next 25 minutes that you're going to ask yourself, why in the world did I come to this church this day, this specific Sunday? I think you're going to say to yourself, this is the strangest sermon I think I've heard in my entire life. And the truth is, you're going to be right, probably, because we're going to be looking at one of the weirdest stories in the whole Bible. Now, others of you might get mad at me as part of this sermon because you've been praying for and inviting maybe your friend or your neighbor or your coworker or family member to tune in and watch us or to come and they've told you no every single time you've asked them. And for whatever reason, they said, yes, we're tuning in today at this sermon. And in just a few minutes, you're going to say to yourself, James, why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me today? Why are you talking about this topic on this Sunday? I mean, of all the topics that you could have chosen to talk about this specific day, you picked this one. I mean, they're watching. They're watching right now on YouTube. They're watching, and after they hear what you're going to say, they're going to think we're crazy. They're going to think we're a cult, and they're never going to come to this place. Thanks a lot, James. Thanks a lot, man. Thanks for being a team player, my dude. You're going to say that. And if you do say that, you need to know you're right. You're right, and you can be mad at me all you want. Those emotions are okay. In fact, I would say if you do get upset, you can send all of your angry emails directly to me at jimhall@yahoo.com. And I'll make sure to get back to you right away, okay? Now, apology tour is over, so are you ready for this? Are you ready? Okay, one's ready. Good. I don't think you're ready, but we're going to do it anyway. So grab a Bible or open up your Bible app and go with me again to the book of Genesis, but this time go to chapter 6. Chapter 6. And buckle up, church. This is going to be a wild ride. Now, we know from the Genesis story so far, as we've been looking at this very first book of the Bible, that the time between the fall of humanity that we saw a few weeks ago in Genesis chapter 3, and now what we're going to be looking at today, Genesis chapter 6, that time frame covers about 1,600 years. And that's where we pick it up in chapter 6. Verse 1 says this: when mankind began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them. Pause there for a second, because there's been a huge population boom that we've seen over the last few chapters. It's growing. The planet population is growing. And there's also, at the exact same time, been an exponential and compounding increase in deviant activities and depravity of human behavior. And the writer of Genesis starts to describe what is happening in the very next verse. Chapter 6, verse 2 says, the sons of God, hold on to that, the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they chose and they took any they chose as wives for themselves. Now, so far in these two verses, you might be saying to yourself, none of this sounds too crazy. I mean, that doesn't sound like the start of the weirdest story in the Bible, James. Why all the hype? Why did you hype it up at the beginning? Just looks like some righteous dudes want to get married and they found them some awesome wives. Is that what is happening there? Well, not exactly. You may not know this. In fact, when I challenge people to read the book of Genesis, a lot of people, almost everybody, says to me, you know what? I never saw this part before. I've never really looked at this. I didn't know what we're about to talk about was even in there. You may not know what we're about to talk about was in there, but biblical scholars have been talking about it for a long time. In fact, biblical scholars, people that think about this stuff like for their full-time jobs, they're divided and debating these verses for like thousands of years. And specifically what they're trying to do in these verses in Genesis chapter 6 is they're trying to figure out who in the world are these sons of God? Who in the world are these sons of God? And some scholars have concluded, number one, that they could be, like we just talked about, they could just be godly men. They're godly men looking for some wives in this story. And some scholars have concluded that's who these people are. Other scholars have concluded, secondly, that they could be oppressive human kings. Like these scholars are saying that these human kings, they're dominant and bullying. They're kind of tyrants and possibly even demon-possessed monarchs or leaders. Others have concluded, thirdly, that they could be angels. These sons of God could be angels. In fact, that phrase, sons of God, is almost exclusively used in the Bible to refer to angelic beings. In the book of the Bible called Job, that phrase, sons of God, is used to describe angelic beings who are attending sort of this celestial staff meeting of all the angels. So scholars have concluded that. 4, other scholars have concluded that they're fallen angels or demons. Remember that the Bible records that a third of all the created angelic beings followed Satan, followed Lucifer, and were cast out of heaven and are now considered, these fallen angels are considered to be demons. And there's one extra one, a bonus one, that someone I know thinks that it's aliens. It's aliens. A pastor friend of mine told me this. He said, I think it's aliens. And I said, what? Why do you think it's aliens? And he's like, well, I read it on the internet, so it's got to be true, right? I'm like, how did you get to be a pastor, man? That's super weird, super weird. So that's a bonus one, that's a bonus one. So the question then becomes, of these 4 or 5 options, what's the answer? Which one is it? Which one is it? And if you're asking me, I would tell you with confidence, I have no idea. I have no idea. In fact, I would argue that nobody really knows. The majority opinion, and I'll put myself in this category, is that the sons of God mentioned in this verse are the option number 4, the fallen angels, the fallen angels. So let's just assume that that's it for 1 second. So that means if I'm correct, if the majority view, the majority view is correct, that there are fallen angels having some sort of forced intimate relations with some of the women on the earth. If I'm correct, and the majority opinion is correct, that's what's happening in that verse 2. And I think you can call that kind of occurrence, I think the technical term for that is creepy, right? It's weird. It's weird that that's happening. And as strange as it sounds, this celestial assault story, this unholy matrimony, you might say, is a very important part of this Genesis narrative because it gives us essential context to what's about to happen next. Look at it in verse 3. And the Lord said, my spirit will not remain with mankind forever because they are corrupt. Hold on to that word. Their days will be 120 years. Now, as you read this, we're only in verse 3 of this chapter, you're starting to see that things are chaotic. There's chaos that is unfolding. Things are becoming unhinged, and God's patience is beginning to run out and run thin. So thin, in fact, that the days of men and women living hundreds and hundreds of years, like we saw in Genesis chapter 5, just the previous verse, those days of century after century of living on the earth, those days are over. God puts an expiration date on humanity, and this new shelf life that he's allowing is 120 years. Which, by the way, Anybody know who the oldest person living on the earth is right now? It's a nice lady named Inah Canabarro Lucas. Lovely lady, Brazilian soccer-loving nun. She was born, and get this, in 1908, and this June 8th, if she makes it that far, she will celebrate her 117th birthday. What's interesting is if you do a Wikipedia search for all the people that have lived the longest, there's one person that has lived 122 years, yet the counting on that is a little questionable. But everything else is under 120 years. Keep in mind, this was written centuries ago. And what we see is that God has kept His word. And my guess is that sounds okay, but what we're going to look at next, you may not have heard before, and you might be like, James, what you're now describing sounds like some unnatural Avengers plot line. And honestly, if I didn't read this with my own eyes in the Bible, I wouldn't believe it was in there. Now here we go. Verse 4, check it out, says this. The Nephilim were on the earth both in those days, the days when the sons of God were with the daughters of man, those days, and afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind who bore children to them. And those children were the powerful men of old, the famous men, the men of renown. Now, if you're looking for a life verse or maybe a tattoo verse, don't make it this one. Like, skip this one, find another one. This is not a good one because it's weird, right? Nephilites, Nephilim, the Hebrew is, heroes, warriors of ancient time. What in the world? Why is this in here? What is this even talking about? Well, what's fascinating is that archaeologists have recently unearthed a picture of one of these Nephilites. There, right there. Yeah. That was in a cave in the Middle East. No, I'm kidding. That's not what I look like under this coat either. Do you know Brock Lesnar? You know Brock Lesnar? U of M wrestler, Ultimate Fighter, WWE now? No, nobody follows that. Anyway, that's his body. This is weird stuff. Interestingly, this word Nephilim, it means giant, and it's mentioned a couple different times throughout the Bible. It's mentioned, for example, in Numbers chapter 13. My guess is you've heard one of the most famous Nephilite members, a little guy by the name of Goliath. You've probably heard of him, but he wasn't a descendant of this original group. It was a name that means giant that was applied to other groups as well. So, were these original Nephilim, these half-angel, half-human giants, were they sort of like this Hercules-like characters in the early years of humanity? Is that who these guys are mentioned here? Again, I don't know. We just don't know because God didn't tell us. But I do know that some people get really into this, figuring out what this is and who they are. I know that we can really get caught up in sort of the nuances of the Bible, the mystery of the Nephilites, running down the endless rabbit trails of Enoch. And I would say to you, if you do that, if that becomes the obsession of what this is supposed to be about, you miss the point of the whole passage. You see, I would make the argument that God included this information, this story, this data in these verses in our origin story, as if to say, God's saying to us, I'm not going to tell you exactly what they were like, these Nephilim, what they were like, because more importantly, I want you to see what it was like in the world in which they lived. I'm not going to give you all the details of the Nephilim and what they were all about. Yeah, speculate it, write books, read blogs, whatever. I'm not going to tell you all the details of what they were like because that's not the point. I want you to see what it was like when they were alive on the earth. And that world gets described in the very next verse. Look at verse 5. When the Lord saw the human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and look at this, look at how this is described, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. Every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. Humanity has hit a new high point in its low point. It's hit a new high in its new low. Sin has reached its crescendo. It's reached its apex. And to reinforce this reality, this diagnosis gets repeated a few verses later. Look at verse 11 in chapter 6. Now the earth was corrupt. And this word is going to be repeated 3 times in these 2 verses. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with wickedness. Verse 12, God saw how corrupt the earth was, for every creature had corrupted its way on the earth. You see, the people in Genesis 6 have fallen into a cesspool of sin that is so deep and so wide, so pervasive, that it has infected and infested every aspect of their existence. And if you track this origin storyline, it makes sense, because the evil one who has slithered into the Garden of Eden just a few chapters ago has now won over an entire culture. And amazingly, if you look back and you sort of analyze Genesis 6 and that society for just a second, what you begin to notice is 4 different cultural characteristics, or 4 different themes that emerge that get set up in this Genesis 6 society. A few characteristics that set it apart. One of those characteristics, you can read in the text, is hero worship. You see that. Secondly, sexual perversion. 3, widespread corruption. And then lastly, what you see, a theme emerging, is one of violence. Hero worship, sexual perversion, widespread corruption, and violence. And man, I'm so very grateful that none of those 4 describe our current cultural condition. #sarcasm, right? But this is why we read in verse 6, maybe the saddest verse in the whole Bible, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he, God, was deeply grieved. I hate that. I mean, literally, just 6 chapters ago, Genesis 1, God leans back as he looks over everything that he had just made, and he declares it to be not just good, but very good. He's looking over everything he created, and he says it's very good, but that's not so now. And his heart is broken about it. Like I said, I think it's one of the saddest verses in the whole Bible. One of the saddest verses in the whole Bible, interestingly, leads us to one of the most shocking verses in the whole Bible. Look at verse 7. Then the Lord said, now that I'm deeply grieved and regretting that I made man, then the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I created, off the face of the earth, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, the birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. I find that to be quite shocking. My tension in this verse 7, is with like John 3:16 says, for God loved the world so much that he was willing to die. And then Genesis 6, reconciling those 2 views of who God is. It's hard for us to reconcile. It's hard for me to reconcile. It's hard for us to grasp. But Genesis 6 shows us that it is possible for God to get to the point where he says, no more. For society to get to the point where he's like, no más. Basta es basta. Enough is enough. It's possible. That's what this shows. It's hard to imagine that God is looking at his creation, created in his image, and seeing it to be beyond recovery. sort of seeing humanity as a cancer that has to be removed or it will kill everything around it. Seeing humanity as this building that is condemned and can't be repaired. Or it's humanity as this diseased tree that can't be nursed back to health, so it's got to be uprooted and thrown away. It's hard to believe that God can get to that point, but Genesis 6 tells us that he can. And at that point is when human intentionality turns its back on its creator, and it turns its back on one another. And it's also the point that breaks the creator's heart the most. God's sad and God's mad because of what creation has done to itself. And as tension-filled as these verses are to me, strangely, it's also good news. Because God wouldn't be God if he did nothing about it. He could not allow this kind of cancer to spread. This epidemic of evil had to find its final moments. It had to be stopped. And so he declares that his grace is given a deadline. Judgment is eventually coming. And we'll look at that next week as we wrap up this origin story series. We'll look at Noah and the flood. But today I want us to wrestle for just a few more minutes with what might be the strangest story in the whole Bible. And as I've spent a lot of time reflecting on this passage, I have a couple questions that I want us to entertain today. First one is this. Are we living in similar days? Are we living in similar days? In other words, does our culture mirror what we see back in Genesis 6? Are we getting close to a same sort of situation? And I would say in many ways, I feel like maybe we are. Which is why I want to show you this statement that Jesus made about what happens when this cultural condition strikes again. It's in Matthew chapter 24. I'll put it up on the screen. Matthew chapter 24, verses 37 through 39. Jesus refers to this kind of cultural condition, this time in society, as the days of Noah. The days of Noah. Verse 37 says, "As the days of Noah were, so the coming of the Son of Man will be." Jesus refers to himself here as the Son of Man. He says he's coming back. Jesus said his return is something that will happen, and you can count on it happening. And part of the character or the criteria for that return is going to be that society is going to be similar to what it was like in Noah's day, into what we've been looking at in these first few verses of Genesis 6. And then, interestingly, Jesus goes on to say in verse 38, "For in those days, in the days of Noah, before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving into marriage until the day Noah boarded the ark." Verse 39, "They didn't know until the flood came and swept them all away. This is the way the coming of the man, Son of Man, will be." So I read that and I ask, are we getting close to that? Maybe. What's interesting is that the people back in Genesis 6 in Noah's day were completely clueless about the fact that they were swimming in a cesspool of immorality and God's patience with humanity was about to run out. They were clueless about that. They were oblivious. They were unaware until they were swimming for their lives. And I would say, Bethany, let's not make that same mistake. Let's not make that same mistake. So are we in similar days? First question leads me to my second question. If we are, what are we supposed to do about it? What are we supposed to do about it? And the answer, I think, is in that first part of the question, which is one word, Noah. Noah is what we're supposed to do about it. So let me end today where we're going to pick up next Sunday. Verse 8. Noah, however, found favor with the Lord. In the midst of the darkness of that day, there was one solitary life. One, by the way, if you keep reading, one extremely flawed person, one incredibly imperfect, one very human being who took a stand when nobody else was willing to do that. Noah, one individual who decided to go north when everybody else was heading south. One person who decided to swim upstream against the cultural current of his day. In fact, Hebrews 11, chapter 7 describes his impact this way. It reads, by faith, or you might be able to translate it more accurately, by his faithfulness, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. It was his life that stood apart from every other activity in the world around him. So the question that we have to, as followers of Jesus, wrestle with today is simply this. Does that type of faithfulness describe our lives as well? Does that type of faithfulness describe who we are and how we come to this life that we live? Are we willing to go against the grain when we know that what's happening around us breaks the heart of God? Think about this question. Ask yourself, is there anything different about the way that I live? Is there anything unique about my faithfulness that would stand out to those around me, to the people around me, to my family that's around me, to my friends around me? Is there anything different about the way that maybe in relationships I relate or I communicate with another individual? Is there anything different about how I talk or how I engage with not only people who agree with me, but people who are different from me? Is there anything different about the things that we do, the decisions we make, the stuff we buy, the things we go to, we say in person, on social media, that would separate us from everybody else? Our faithfulness to God, does it make any difference by how it's different than the rest of the world? Is it like Noah's faithfulness? When you go to work tomorrow or wherever you go tomorrow, is it like Noah's faithfulness? When you think about the way that you run your business, or you go to the office, or the factory, or the way that you interact with your colleagues or your co-workers, in the way that you close deals or achieve the next benchmark or the next goal. When we think about work through that lens, is there anything different than everybody else that we work or spend time with? Is the faithfulness that we exhibit in the circles we live in, is it something that honors God? Is it something that points to Him? You see, these questions are what Genesis 6 brings to light and pulls out for us to consider. Does faithfulness to our Creator describe our lives like it did Noah's life? And if it doesn't, that's okay. That's okay, because we're all growing here. The question is the direction there? Not the perfection, but is the direction there? Am I moving toward Noah-like faithfulness in my life? And so as I close today, I want to offer two invitations for you. Number one, to consider the questions that I put in the study guide. In the program, in the bulletin, I added a little study guide in there, the questions right at the very end. Take some time this week and read through that. And ask yourselves, be honest before yourself, with yourself, and before God as well, to evaluate where you are in your Noah-like faithfulness. And then secondly, come back next week. Come back next week. Because as we look at Noah together, we're going to find out what it's going to take to live a life, to build a life that gives God the most glory, that honors Him in a world that doesn't. And I'm excited for us to see what that looks like. So let's pray together. God, we thank you for this moment, and we thank you, God, for who you are. God, we thank you for what you've given us in this crazy story in Genesis 6. God, we're grateful for the stories of grace that we see all throughout the Bible, but God, at the exact same time, we are also thankful for these sort of cautionary tales that you give us, that challenge us, that push us to become more of the person that you've designed us to be. And so, God, I thank you for Genesis 6, this wild, weird account. God, help us to pull out your truth in it, not revel in the mystery, but yet align our lives with your revealed truth. And God, whatever that is for each of us, I pray that we would have the courage to take a step in that direction today. Not that we are reaching some sort of perfection in our own minds, God, but we are looking in the direction of what Noah-like faithfulness will be for each one of us. And God, we take that scary step, whatever that next scary step is. God, we give you this time. We give you a moment to work on our hearts as we sing these words, that as we battle against the darkness of this world, that we have weapons that we can use to push back that darkness with your light. And so, God, we thank you that you've called us to that. And we thank you most of all for Jesus, who is the light of the world. Help us to follow him into the dark places around us. We pray these things in his name. And all God's people said, amen. Let's stand and